Hey, what's up, Firechild Nation? Chad Allen here, and welcome to episode 6 of Back to the Basics, our final installment of our basic training series. This one, we're just going to talk briefly about rendering. Now, if you know me at all, when I say briefly, you know that means lots and lots of rambling. I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum. As you can see, normally with my videos, I'll present you with a final render, final look of what our render is going to look like, and show you what we'll be creating. As you can see here, I've got this partial render that I canceled 5 seconds into it, and I did that on purpose because I want to illustrate our first point, and the most important thing is patience. You need patience when it comes to rendering. If you thought that modeling, doing materials, texturing, animation, any of that was a pain in the butt and a time consumer, then that's nothing compared to rendering. Rendering takes time. However, it's not as big a pain in the butt. You set a few settings, you hit the button to render, you walk away, you drink a beer, you have a Dos Equis, you play some Call of Duty Black Ops, you come back and check on it every 20 minutes or so. I've had renders, when it comes to still images, I've had renders take anywhere from 15 seconds to several hours to render. It all depends on how complex, how many polygons, if you have ray tracing. It depends on a lot of things that we're not covering in a basic training series, but just want to illustrate that rendering takes time. I've had animations, 30-second animations that I've done for clients take upwards of 20 to 24 hours to render. So patience, patience, patience. Remember that as we get into this. Now, what I want to show you is I just want to go through a few of the quick settings. I've had some comments on my Superman text tutorial, the opening credit tutorial, on, okay, I've done all this, I've animated, how do I get this to a video file? How do I get it onto my computer and out of Blender? How do I render the dang thing? F12 will give you a still frame, but it's not going to save a file anywhere except maybe to the temporary folder. You want to save it, say, to your desktop. How do you do that? Well, I'm not going to render this whole thing because we're doing a quick tutorial, so I'm just going to create a new file here. I'm just going to leave the basic cube, everything basic. Hit F12, render it. How do I get it to the desktop now? Well, without going into any settings here, what you could do to save a still image, not an animation, but a still image, is hit F3. F3 on the keyboard will bring up your save place, save it to your desktop, wherever you want. It's going to save it as a PNG, so you can just put delete my ass, because I'm not saving a default render of a cube. And then hit save as, and it'll save it to your desktop as a PNG, which is a great file format, so highly recommend that. And that's how to save a still image. Now, that doesn't include any settings, but let's say, for example, the Superman tutorial, you want to render out an animation. Well, what we need to do is we need to go into our render tab, and actually this will apply to image or animation. We'll get to the animation here in a second, but let's go over a few of the settings, just the basic settings. We've got some more advanced settings here that we're not getting into in the basics, because this is just to give you a foundation. This is just to show you beginners how to get your video out of Blender. So first thing is you can set, you got all these presets for PAL, NTSC, HDV, HDTV, all of these different settings. Pick your preset, or you can go in and set your resolution. See, Blender's got a little hiccup here, so let's give it a second to catch up with me. Seems like anytime I use my screen recording software, things slow down. But, you know, say you want standard resolution, 724, 486 if you're in NTSC. Now this slider underneath, which is at default, it's at 50. But let's go ahead and bump this up 1920 by 1080. Let's do full HD. If you leave it at 50%, hit F12, it'll bring up your render. But what it's doing is it's actually rendering at half this resolution, 50% of this resolution. So if you set it down to 25%, it'd be rendering at, see, much smaller resolution, at a quarter resolution. Or you can set it, 75%, then you got 3/4 resolution. That's helpful for if you're doing test renders to just see what it looks like and you don't want to save a final. I'll usually set it between 25 and 50, or just leave it at the default 50. Render it out, and then once I'm happy with it, I'm ready for final render, then I'll be sure to bump that up to 100% so that it's rendering at full 1920 by 1080. As you can see, much larger box. So that's important to note. You also have your frame range settings, so if you're doing an animation, if you want to render the entire timeline or just a portion of the timeline, you can, you know, put in 100, so you're rendering just 150 frames, things like that. Pretty self-explanatory. Frame rate, 24 for film, 29.97 if you're doing NTSC, TV. All these little things, those are pretty self-explanatory. I usually bump up my anti-aliasing to 16, as high as it'll go, for a more smooth, realistic result. I'll keep it at 5 at the lowest setting when I'm doing test renders, because that'll improve my render times and make things faster. And now when I talk about render times, and earlier I was saying that Blender takes forever to render, I wasn't picking on Blender. 3ds Max, Lightwave, Maya, they all take time to render. Rendering is insanely time consuming. The faster your machine, the faster it's going to render. If you have a render farm and you have several computers networked together to render, obviously much faster there, but it still takes time. Rendering is like I said, patience, patience, patience. So, you know, set that to 16 when you're ready for final render. Skip through a few of these things because we're just worried about how to export. We set our output, just click on the folder, kind of like loading a photo, but we're going the opposite way. Set where you want to delete me, where you want to save it. I want to save it to the desktop, so okay, so now it's got a path of to the desktop, and the file name will be delete me. Here we've got all the different formats, file formats for exporting. You've got your movie formats for animation. Personally, I like to, even with animation or stills, I like to use PNG, and if it's an animation, it'll render a PNG sequence, which is, you know, an entire sequence of individual PNG images that I'll save to a particular folder. And I always, this is just me, I always load that into whatever editor I'm using, or if I want to do some post effects, I'll load it into After Effects, do my final effects, and then I'll render out my final image from there. But that's completely up to you. If you'd rather use one of these movie presets, the H.264 for example, that's fine too. I was just explaining that normally I'll render out PNG. So that is that. We've got here, you can render a black and white image, an RGB image, or RGBA, which will preserve your alpha, as this cube has no floor to sit on. This is really just an alpha background. This will preserve the alpha, so say you create a logo that you want to lay over video in your video editor, you would be sure that you don't have anything in the background behind your logo. Turn on RGBA. Then when you render, it'll preserve that alpha background to where you can load it into your editor. You won't have to worry about trying to key anything or Luma mat or any of that crap. It just makes much quicker result. So that's the basics of the render settings. And then obviously once you've set your path here and you've got your animation ready, you click the animation button. And of course I don't have any animation here, but you'll see right here we've got frame 1, and now it's going to render frame 2. And it's going to go on 250 frames. Of course, there's no animation, so it's going to be 250 individual. Let me cancel that now before it fills up my desktop with PNGs. 250 PNGs of a very badly lit cube with no texture. So you can use H.264, all of this, experiment with it, but that's basically how you get your video or your still image out of Blender into the real world. So I'm not sure if I mentioned this before. I've kind of been rambling a little bit, but instead of, you can hit image. The best way to save the image is to render your image, hit F3, do your PNG. That's what I would recommend. But that's how you get your still image out. That's how you get your animations out. Hopefully, if you watch the Superman video, once you've put everything together and you've got it animated and it does the stretch and the flyby and you're ready to export it out of Blender, that's how you do it. You go to your render tab, set your dimensions, set your resolution, pick your file path right here, pick your file format, decide if you want RGB or RGBA. With the Superman one, we had a star background, so we just leave it at RGB. Makes for a faster render. And then go up here, hit animation, go have a Coke and a smile, and come back, and I guarantee you that that Superman tutorial, I'll pop up a link to it here somewhere, that Superman tutorial will take a while to render, several hours in fact. worth it in the end. And again, I'm not picking on Blender, that's everybody. Now, speaking of animation, I don't believe I really touched too heavily on animation in our basic training series, because animation is a very broad term for an entire world of tools. So I may possibly, do not hold me to this if I don't get around to it, but I may possibly include an episode 7 to cover some animation basics, but I can't promise you anything, as I have several other tutorials that discuss animation, and you can always reference those for more information on doing animation. Anyway, guys, I'm at the 10-minute mark. I've rambled quite enough, and I've probably talked much longer than need be for a basic rendering tutorial, so I'm going to shut up now and say thank you for watching this basic training series. If you're new to Blender and you're new to the 3D world, welcome. It's good to have you. I can't wait to see some of the things you guys can do. So, that being said, Firechild Video, we have a user gallery. You can head over to firechildvideo.blogspot.com. You can send us your renders. I will upload them to the user gallery. I will showcase them and premiere the hell out of them to get you guys some exposure, because this is a community. It's not just me, so I want to see what you guys can do. Send me your stuff. I'll have a link with my email address in the description somewhere below. I'd love to see what you guys can render. Remember, set your scene, everything's ready to go. Hit F12, hit F3, save it, and then email that sucker to me, and I will get it on the website. So anyway, once again, thank you guys for watching. More exciting tutorials are in the works. I know it's been slow going. I've had just lists of things to do. It's been a very, very busy month. But I am getting more tutorials cranked out here soon. Stay tuned for that. Thank you once again for the basic training series, and happy blending.